This is not a sponsored video. Gear review! Ow, fuck! Welcome everyone to part 2 of my Canon 5 and 6D series, and today we're going to be talking about the Canon 6D Mark II. The Canon 6D Mark II is a very significant camera in my life, and I know, I started the 5D Mark III video like that too, but the 6D Mark II is significant in my life for very different reasons. The 6D Mark II is the camera that filmed almost every video you've seen on this channel. In fact, I picked up this camera in May of 2018. That month might be ringing some bells. The end of May 2018 is the month I decided I would start posting weekly. And though I didn't catch into that cycle immediately, the 6D Mark II was meant to be the camera to get me through that grind. 1 year later, here I am still shooting on it. So let's answer the question, is the Canon 6D Mark II worth buying in 2019? No. Oh, I couldn't help myself on that. Don't be mad, it's just a prank, bro. I genuinely think there's too much hyperbole on the internet surrounding this camera. It's not the best, and it's not the worst. I mean, it does some things right and it does some things wrong. It's just an alright camera. If you're already in the Canon ecosystem, you have a bunch of those lenses, and you want a video camera with a flip-out screen and dual pixel autofocus, there really aren't a ton of options. The 6D Mark II is one of the few. For what I'm doing right now, the 6D Mark II makes a little bit more sense. And in order to explain that, we have to talk about the video mode. So we're going a little bit out of order. Normally I do photo, video, ease of use, ergonomics. This one we're starting on the video because I bought this camera mainly for video. And a quick note for you sweeties out there, I don't like that nickname very much, but whatever. Normally, I split my reviews into sections, keeping ergonomics and ease of use last. That's gonna be pretty hard for me on this camera, so enjoy hearing about everything together like the rantings of a lunatic. One of the features I cared about the most when I was picking up the 6D Mark II was the dual pixel autofocus. My hope was to get a reliable camera that I could just set and forget. The 6D Mark II really does check off a lot of those boxes. It's really simple to use. It's probably one of the easiest Canon cameras I've ever used. And what I love about it is that once it's set to go, I could literally hand this to someone who has never held a camera before, and I'll get usable video footage out of it. And like I said, you've been staring at this camera for a long time if you've been on my channel for a while, so in the right circumstances, this camera can really shine. But with that simple nature comes a lot of drawbacks. The dual pixel autofocus in the 6D Mark II, it's an enigma to me. Alright, so the question, I guess we gotta get this off the bottom. Okay, so the thought is, we have to find out, Pokemon Go, you gotta move, I'm sorry. We have to find out if flex tape will become rigid when it sticks to itself. Stupid fucking thing. Oh, great. Yeah, 60, don't even worry about it. You don't have to focus. In my experience though, I will say the dual pixel autofocus typically works better when you're working with faces, with people. Like most of the time when I see that crosshair lock onto someone's face, chances are it's staying there. There are times where it's scary how good it is. There are times where it'll snap onto someone's face a million light years away and be on that person like me on coffee. I drink a lot of coffee if you're new here. Then there are times where I have to stop and ask, like, 6D, you okay there? There we go. So for me, the jury's still out. It's difficult for me to just give it a glowing review because while it does work great most of the time, I'd say like a solid 75-80% of the time it works well, but the rest of the time when it doesn't work, oof man, it really does not work. It really just goes bananas. Right, so this bit goes into so oh my god, 6D. I always talk about how good you are. Fuck. Okay, yeah, I'll just wait for you. That's fine. No big deal. I'll just wait. That's fine. The autofocus point set on the fucking. Anyway, it's about time we rip a few video band-aids off. Are you ready? Prepare your butthole. There's no IBIS, there's no C-Log, there's no 4K, and everything's recorded in a lower video bitrate. Whew, that's a lot to unpack. Let's go through that a little bit. The lack of C-Log and in-body image stabilization, I can understand, I can get behind that. I get that they have to sell the more expensive cameras. I also recognize the fact that they branded this as an entry-level full-frame DSLR. So those features are kind of, quote, high level, as nice as they would have been to have. But the lack of 4K and the lack of the higher video bitrate compressions is a big deal, especially to me, again, someone who bought the camera for video. Well, technically I guess you can shoot 4K, but it's only in the included time-lapse mode, which I will say is pretty cool actually. I do like the fact that you can do a full manual time-lapse. It's really simple to set up and you can even control how long the final output is. It just saves it as a single QuickTime MOV file. That's a pretty damn cool feature, and I have done some really cool things with it. But I mean, if you can record a 4K time-lapse, why can't you record 4K video? Is it something to do with the sensor? No, that can't be, because the 5D Mark III with Magic Lantern can do it, and that sensor is like 5 years older. Maybe it's Canon arbitrarily removing features so that people will buy other cameras. But conspiracy theories aside, let's get back on track. Canon removed the all-I codecs from the 6D Mark II, meaning that you can only shoot in IPB. For those of you who aren't entirely sure of the difference between all-I and IPB, here's a quick rundown. Essentially, the all-I compression translates to higher bitrate and therefore higher quality video. I am oversimplifying this a little bit, but to get a bit of a visual representation, all-I treats frames individually, whereas IPB takes elements from multiple frames and compresses them together. So you have less clarity in the individual frames in the IPB. And as a result, you start to see the video footage is generally a little bit softer than something like the 5D Mark III or the Sony a7S. You are ultimately getting lower quality video, and that can go back to why some people talk about how soft the video looks on here, or the dynamic range issues. It all comes down to less information in the files. But here's the real talk. I think the destination of your video is really important, because if you're just uploading this to YouTube, it's going to get recompressed anyway, and you might not really notice the difference between all-I and IPB compressions. If you're handing off a super high-res file to a client, this kind of thing might matter. Due to the fact that this camera had the flip-out screen and the dual-pixel autofocus, I think this camera really took on the branding of a vlogging camera. And taking a second to get away from complaining constantly, the flip-out screen, it's great. It's bright enough to see out in the sunlight, it flips in all different directions so you can shoot low, you can shoot high, you can see yourself. It's a great monitor, and the touchscreen is very responsive. But a camera that's seemingly marketed towards vloggers, it's strange that some of the video features would be so lacking, like the fact that there's no 120p. That is a very common feature that vloggers care about. It does have 60, which is a step up from the 5D, and I guess I can live with that, but if you care about that 120, you better look elsewhere. But all these things I've mentioned so far, I mean, you can work around them. You don't have 120p, you shoot in 60, you can still slow it down. But for this next thing, there's not a ton of workarounds, and there's not really a lot of good excuses as to why it's not there. The 6D Mark II doesn't have a headphone jack. I mean, you guys knew it was coming. I must have said that a million times on this channel before. But how annoying and arbitrary is that? The 5D Mark III has a headphone jack. The 6D Mark I had a headphone jack. Oh wait, no it didn't. Thanks for sending me the photo, Chris. My Samsung Galaxy has a headphone jack. Look, you see this? You can connect a wired remote here to do a remote shutter release, right? It's great for time lapses, which is something the camera can do internally without a remote. It could have been a headphone jack. And I understand that people who would be using this camera for vlogging purposes wouldn't be wearing headphones while they're vlogging. I mean, that would be pretty stupid, honestly. But to me, this seemed like a video camera, and monitoring your audio is such a basic function of a video camera. So if we're continuing to play devil's advocate here, you can monitor audio with your eyes. Stay with me here. You actually can use the flip out screen and see the audio meters moving in real time while you record, which, I mean, it's an important feature, but wouldn't you prefer headphones, especially if you're behind the camera? The other really important thing to talk about is the audio preamps within the 6D Mark II. Now, audio preamps is not something I would typically talk about, but in this camera they are just so special they needed an honorary mention. The 6D Mark II's preamps are kinda not great. I'm going to show you a quick comparison between the three main cameras of this channel, the 5D Mark III, the 6D Mark II, and the Sony a7S. The first test is just going to be the camera's internal mic, no external mic plugged in. Alright, this is a stupid song by a terrible band. I'm hoping you can hear the difference through all the YouTube compression and all that fun stuff. If you wear headphones, it's probably more obvious, but you can hear there's a major difference between the 5D Mark III and the 6D Mark II. The 6D Mark II seems to have less bass, and it's a little tinnier on the whole. When you plug in an external mic, the problem isn't nearly as bad though. So for the second part of this test, I'm going to plug in the Rode VidMic Pro. I'm going to set their audio gains around the lower end, maybe a quarter, maybe a third of the bar. We'll try and match them as closely as possible. Normally what I do is I keep the preamp on the camera relatively low so that I can boost the mic and get a better signal. That was Cute Without the E by Taking Back Sunday. That's for all my emo kids out there. That was Under Oath. That was for you, Luke. And that was a plane that just went by. That was Sandstorm by Darude. So while plugging in an external mic helps out a lot, the 6D Mark II's preamps just aren't up to snuff, at least not with the 5D Mark III's. Now normally you would plug in an external mic, right? If you're using this for video, most people have some sort of external audio solution, but it is something to consider. The 6D Mark II can make some splendid images provided you work around the hurdles Canon so kindly provided. Let me explain. On the 5D Mark III, Canon had this joystick. Aptly named, it brought me much joy. You could use it to select your single point autofocus. You might remember this if you watched part 1 of this series. The joystick was an amazing feature. It's probably my favorite part of the 5D Mark III. So clearly it had a go. You could still use the included directional pad, but it's in the wrong place for your thumb, and it's really clunky. And with 49 autofocus points, using this weird little D-pad, it just becomes frustrating and takes forever. If I had to sum up the photography mode on this camera, I would just say it's clunky to varying degrees. If you care about autofocus, you can do better, especially for the price point. You get 49 autofocus points that are all stacked in the middle, so edge-to-edge coverage, it's just not a thing. You're definitely going to be focusing and recomposing. And I'm sure I don't have to explain why that workflow doesn't work for everybody. If you use the continuous autofocus, I found that the camera really doesn't love snapping onto people's eyes. When I first got the camera, I assumed I needed to calibrate the autofocus. I made micro adjustments, I swapped lenses, I tried other people's lenses, and then I realized, nah, that's just kind of how it is. Sometimes the autofocus is right on the money and other times it isn't. It's kind of like the video. If you are into that manual focus life, you'll have a good time on this camera. But to me, the autofocus is not reliable enough. I can't tell you how many times I'd come home and see photos that were just slightly out of focus. And that was never an issue with my 5D Mark III. We touched on the dynamic range in the video section before, but now we can go a little bit deeper on this one. Here is a great example of the lack of dynamic range in the 6D Mark II. Over here we have a lot of shadows in the foreground of this photo. There's a lot of trees here. This is Tudor City in Manhattan. It looks straight down 42nd Street. Great spot. There's always a ton of photographers there. You can make some new friends. You might even see me there sometimes. Anyway, if we go in and try and lift these shadows here just to bring out a little detail, you get nothing. It's just this muddy, disgusting shit, it's like there's no information recorded whatsoever there. So in reality with this camera, it doesn't really matter if you're shooting RAW or not, because it is what it is to a certain degree. Unless you nail that exposure, you're not going to lift the shadows too far, and you're not going to recover the highlights too far. So in a lot of scenarios, I kind of found myself saying it's one or the other. I'm either going to expose for the sky or expose for the shadows. And to me, the whole point of shooting RAW and having these crazy fancy cameras is that maybe I don't want to decide that in the moment. Maybe I want to go home and figure it out. And you can't do that on this camera. Now that we've talked a lot about the video and the photo mode in this camera, let's take a look at the body itself. The grip is nice, it feels alright in the hand, and it's definitely not too chunky. We did lose the dedicated white balance button on the top, which was a really great feature in the 5D Mark III, but it is easily accessed on the touchscreen, so not a big deal, I guess. The menus, they're still super clean, they're a breeze to use, very easy to navigate, especially with the touchscreen. I gotta be honest with you, I didn't think I would be using the menus on the touchscreen. I thought I would be using the dedicated D-pad for that, but I ended up really liking the touchscreen. You only have a single slot for an SD card. The camera has Wi-Fi, NFC, GPS, and Bluetooth. I don't really mess with any of those features, to be honest with you. But I will say the ability to connect and control your camera through the Canon app is dope. I just really hope that you enjoy a significant delay and 4 frames per second playback on the app, because that's what you get. It's not great. You might notice that this B-roll just says waiting to connect. Well, it took me about 15-20 minutes and it still didn't connect, and I decided I didn't care that much. So just use your imagination, and as you can see, the app pairing is not the most seamless experience ever. I'm just done. I just don't care. So before I start wrapping this video up here, I just wanted to take a quick second here to kind of talk about this video, because it is a little bit different than my normal gear review. When I first got my hands on the camera, I was really stoked to use it. It felt like a camera from the future. It had a ton of features that my 5D Mark III didn't have. And as time went on, I started to notice these small issues. And at the beginning, I kind of just overlooked a bunch of them, or I just dealt with them. But over the course of a year, a lot of these small problems really add up, and things that you didn't think were a big deal start to become a big deal. I found this review pretty difficult to make, just because I found it hard to put that sentiment into words, the idea that I just slowly started to not love this camera anymore. The 6D Mark II is a formidable camera in theory, right? The specs are there, the flip screen's there, the dual pixel autofocus is there, the 4K isn't, the headphone jack isn't, the C-Log isn't, the dynamic range isn't. Alright, I'll stop. It gets some things right, but in terms of a DSLR, I think it favors more on the video side of things, even with its issues. But for the price, I think there are so many better options out there. The Panasonic GH5 is right in the same price range, and it blows this camera out of the water. Hell, Canon's 80D, I hate that name, is basically the same exact camera. It's got the flip screen, it's got the autofocus, it's just an APS-C size sensor. And it's half the price, so why not go with that? And if I'm not mistaken, that one has a headphone jack. As my year of experience with the 6D Mark II comes together in this review, it's hard not to feel like there are infinitely better choices in the same price range. The A7S Mark II, the A7 Mark III, the Fujifilm X-T3. But if you're in the Canon ecosystem, you have a bunch of Canon lenses you don't want to part with, the 6D Mark II could work for you. I mean, let's face it, despite all of its flaws and all the frustrations, it's still been my daily driver for this channel for the past year. If this thing was completely broken, I would have ditched it. It's far from perfect, but in the right scenarios, it can get the job done, provided you have a little bit of patience with it. And I'm giving the Canon 6D Mark II a very fitting 6 Owen Wilson wows out of 10. Just kidding, that would have been really cool, but no, I'm actually giving it 5 Owen Wilson wows out of 10, because I feel like half the time it works and half the time it doesn't. Half the features are right, half the features aren't there. If you're buying this thing new and it's close to $2,000, get the fuck out of here. Do not spend that money on this camera. If you can get a used deal, if you can find it cheaper elsewhere, that's more manageable. But $2 grand for this, go get a A7 Mark III. Don't waste the money. Anyway, guys, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the video. This is part 2 of 3. Part 3 should be coming out next week unless I'm a fuck up. Part 3 will pit the 5D Mark III versus the 6D Mark II and tell you my thoughts on which one would be better for you and why. So as always, smash that subscribe. Let me know what you think. Do you have the 6D Mark II? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Do you think I'm crazy? Do you think I'm completely on the money for it? Whatever, I want to know what you think. And make sure you hit me up on Instagram. Horseman's on Instagram too. And yeah, MySpace is a thing. Follow me on there and Discord. Love you. Bye. Welcome to part 2 of the 5. Welcome. What a great way to start. Normally I split my review. So the jury is out. I can't really give the dual pixel autofocus a oh my god. On the 5D Mark III, Canon had this joystick app. Go watch that video if you haven't seen it already. When it doesn't work, it really does not work. Fuck. Well, thanks for sending me the crisp pic. Wow.